Hello, I'm Ed Rabyd, otherwise known as the Rabyd Atheist, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. You're free to like or dislike the video, so please feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like. This is going into part 9 of my series entitled The 10 Commandments Suck. I'll leave a link to the entire playlist so that if you want to go back and start from the beginning and hit the first video, you can do that. So the playlist will be above my head at some point here. But we have basically covered Exodus 20, where we had the first statement of what would be considered by most people to be the 10 Commandments. Then we hit Exodus 34, which is what the Bible calls the 10 Commandments, but those commandments have far more to do with religious ritual than any other moral code or anything like that. And the real problematic thing about them is they're supposed to be a restatement of the original 10 that were on the tablets, but they end up being completely different than the ones that are originally given. So there's that problem. And then we get to Deuteronomy chapter 5 here, where the 10 Commandments are restated again, and they're very much like Exodus chapter 20. And last time we kind of pushed our way through the first commandments, observe the Sabbath day and so on and so forth. And we get to Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 16. And the text goes, "Honor your father and your mother, as the Lord your God has commanded you, that your days may be prolonged, and that it may go well with you in the land which the Lord your God gives you." I think, as I stated before, the real problem I have at this point with the Bible, I guess, is in general, and with the 10 Commandments in particular, is there seems to be this overbearing sense of a need for authority. A good leader, a good ruler, in my opinion, doesn't need to use their office to lead. They lead by the fact that people want to follow. And so when I see stuff like this, I get a little bit antsy in the first place, where, you look at a command where it says honor your father and mother. Once again, we're dealing with authority questions. Throughout this series, the one thing we have noted is that authority is something that God stands on rather than, his actions of compassion all the time. The fact is, if you take the actions of God up until this point, he is completely if the story was true, here's what's happened so far in the narrative. You get the Exodus going out, where the Egyptians are basically drowning baby boys. Moses gets saved despite all that. You get God bringing Moses up through about 80 years of continual bondage to his people. You get to the end of 400 years and Moses gets called back in. What has God done so far to deliver his people? Well, he's devastated another Egyptian economy. The Egyptian economy has completely collapsed. The kingdom of Egypt has been made defenseless, made, ruined, agricultural ruin, economic ruin, all kinds of untold suffering and misery. The firstborn of every Egyptian thing, including cattle and whatever, has died. All of this for God to prove a point against the gods of Egypt, which I find very interesting, because then God comes along with all this authority stuff. I've done this for you, I've done this for you, I've delivered you, I delivered you, I delivered you. Please, now that I have taken you away from your Egyptian masters, now you need to bow down to me as your master. So I'm not really sure when we talk about whether or not God liberated people from the bondage. The idea of bondage seems to be very prevalent in the Bible. The idea of freedom doesn't really come into it at this point. You're just moving bondage from one thing to another. Nor does the Bible at this point find the authority of master to slave a problem, because even though they were held in Egypt for slavery, and bondage, the authority question continues to come up. And so then we get to this verse, and we've already seen it in Exodus 20, and we're seeing it again here. This idea of honoring and obeying your parents, period. No conditions, no idea whether or not authority can be abused or not. I mean, if you're going to be a tyrannical dictator or you're going to create a dictatorial kind of religious oligarchy in the priesthood, then you don't want that authority questioned. The best way for you to get other authorities on your side is to back those authorities. Everybody's going to have a father and a mother, and because you back those authorities, those people will, of course, back the regime because you're backing them. What else is behind this command is also the idea that there is a commandment that says that parents can put their child to death if they are willfully rebellious and disobedient against their parents. I find this very interesting that the so-called God, who will later be called Father, Jesus uses Heavenly Father and Father, your Father in heaven, over and over again. The idea that God is a loving Father is a very New Testament concept. But if this is the same God that inspired this part of the Bible back here in Exodus and Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch in general, God, when it comes to the authority of parents, basically says that parents have authority over their children, not only to give them life, but to give them death. And so this honor is done basically at the end of a point of a sword. Either honor me or you'll die. I mean, it becomes obvious, that your days aren't going to be prolonged in the land God gives you if you're a rebellious child, because your parents can kill you. And so when you look at this passage, you need to understand that there is no questioning of authority in the Bible. Authority is basically placed in place, and the Bible backs up every authority that you can imagine. The authority of rulers, the authority of kings, the authority of the priesthood, the authority of prophets, later on the authority of kings and judges, and here the authority of mothers and fathers. And there is no thought of, well, what if people abuse their authority? Do you not have a right to rebel against that? The answer is no. You have the master-slave relationship. No, the master isn't to be questioned over the slave. And so this idea of authority and power is very much in the Bible. And when we get here, you'd think, oh, this is very benign. You should obey your parents. Yeah, but if your parents are abusive or they're asking you to do things that are illegal or immoral, why would you want to have a commandment that can basically be said that there is no exception clause here? It's a blanket statement. You will honor your father and mother, and that's just the end of it. I have to I've stated this argument before when I went through Exodus 20. I think it bears repeating, because when we talk about the Ten Commandments in general, what we're talking about is the validity of commandments. And the validity of commandments basically comes down, is the authority behind those commandments valid? And does that command actually bring about moral good? Does it bring about prosperity? Does it bring about longer life? When you look at goodness, I think goodness as a general rule can be easily defined as, people living better and living longer and enjoying the life that they're living. Well, authority that's blindly followed very rarely leads to those qualities for the people that follow. That's why you should never blindly necessarily follow authority. That's just not something that you should do. And so there is that aspect of it. So this commandment is problematic for me because authority can be abused. But it's just one more example of all the authorities throughout the scripture that are just backed. No question, no argument. I mean, you get into the New Testament, Paul basically says, hey, governments are ordained by God, so you have to obey them. End of discussion. Well, what if your authority by God is just wiping people out and killing them? It seems to me that at that point, such a commandment is not very moral, because you're allowing the authority to abuse the people that are under them. And that's just not right. And here you have honor your father and mother. And I'm sorry, I've seen enough abuse cases to know that not all fathers and mothers should be honored. I think honor as a parent is earned. You should do things that are honorable to earn the respect of your kids. You should be fair and as just as possible. You should also realize that you really don't rule over your children. Your job is to raise them, and your job is to, build a better human being than yourself by leading them into things that'll help them become better human beings, teaching them things. I think being a teacher is far more important than being authoritarian. That kind of authority where you have to demonstrate that what you're teaching your child has value, to me, is a better way to go about parenting. And so that's kind of where I stand on that. Now, as we get into the other commands, we've seen these before. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. It's kind of a little bit of a laundry list there. I'm going to reiterate some of the things that I've already said because it's a good way to review. Murder and stealing are pretty much universal no-nos in any law code of the ancient world. You will not find, like the Code of Hammurabi, some of the other law codes that exist, there's always a prohibition against murder, and there's always a prohibition against stealing. And so you always have these prohibitions. Adultery gets interesting because, as I pointed out, it's not adulterous for a man, for instance, to go out and get a second wife and thus sleep with her. It is very much against the idea of adultery for a woman to try to do the same. What you really see here with a commit adultery command is a man being able to protect his property, namely his wife or wives. Basically, he's saying that those nuptial rights are mine. I own them. I own my wives, and so therefore I owe my right to them sexually. When you really look at the law, boy, I'm going to reiterate and say this is a very misogynistic idea. There's also a problem with adultery because the penalty is death. And I think that's a little bit extreme. In the act of adultery, yes, a lot of people's feelings are hurt. Yes, there is some societal violations there, and you create some problems. It has its own punishments that I think are severe enough. But the idea that somebody needs to die because two people that aren't married or one person who's married to somebody else is having sex with somebody else, I'm not sure that merits a death penalty, and it's not even really the Bible's own standard of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. So I'm not sure how that works. And once again, I think that's problematic. When you look at these four commands right in order, the murder and stealing commandment, no duh. We didn't need God's revelation to tell us that it's a bad idea to kill people and it's a bad idea to steal, because I don't want to be killed and I don't want to have my stuff taken from me. So I should respect the life and property of other people. So it's kind of one of those no duh things. And, I'm glad they're in the 10 Commandments. I suppose it merits a place there, but I'm not sure about, whether or not it's unique or divine revelation to say you shouldn't kill somebody or shouldn't steal their stuff. I don't think you need a divine revelation for that. And you shall not commit adultery. Once again, protecting property rights, and punishment's a little bit severe if you ask me. Also, I think other things like, you shall not own another human being would have been far more advantageous than you shall not commit adultery here. The one unique, I think, commandment is you shall not bear false witness. The idea of perjury and lying on the stand comes from this, and that is a fairly unique concept in the ancient world. You don't see it very often, so it's nice to see it here. It's one of the few commands that I don't think completely sucks, except it's not really a prohibition against lying. And when you really look at the story of the Bible, when you look at some of the things that happens in the Bible, some people tell some pretty interesting whopper lies. Even in the story of Exodus, the midwives are like, "Oh, sorry, before we even get there, these Hebrew women, they've already given birth and they've already hid away their child." Yeah, they're lying. Okay, so it's not a prohibition against lying; it's a prohibition against perjury. When it's time to give witness in a court trial or a thing like that, you have to be truthful. These are all pretty sundry commands. They have some moral fiber to them. But a lot of them I could justify without revelation from God. I don't need God to reveal to me that some of these things are bad or good. So it's not really kind of new or unique here. Let me get down to verse 21. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not desire your neighbor's house, his field, or his male servant or his female servant, his ox or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. In other words, anything that your neighbor possesses. It's interesting that neighbor's wife, once again, women are property. Okay. Servants, slaves are property. House is property, fields property. All these things that belong to your neighbor, you're not supposed to covet them. Not supposed to desire them. I suppose we could quibble on the idea that you are allowed to desire something like them. You're just not allowed to desire what your neighbor possesses. But that doesn't preclude. I mean, let's say I desire, my neighbor has a car and I would like to have it. I don't think that means that I'm automatically going to start a plan to steal it. I may simply go over and say, hey man, how attached are you to that car? I really like it and I'm willing to pay X dollars. And he might take it and he might say, no, it's not for sale. It's never going to be for sale. I can desire that car without necessarily going over the boundaries of stealing or killing for it. So, I mean, there's other ways to negotiate this. We're really getting into the area of thought crime here, that God wants his commandments so followed that he doesn't even want you thinking about things. Once again, we get into Jesus, lust equals adultery, anger equals murder, desiring something that your neighbor possesses equals greed. I don't know. At this point, you're trying to control the thoughts of people, and I'm not really sure how good that is. If you're so insecure as a ruler of your people that you have to control who they worship, their artwork. I mean, if you look at all the 10, you're controlling their artwork, you're controlling all the different influences that come into your country, you're having masters and husbands and parents, be your underling authority to your rule. You've really just gone after it. And now you get on top of everything else, you're going to say, hey, don't even think wrong. Don't think wrong ever. I'm going to tell you something. It's this thought crime idea that used to bother me the most as a Christian, because it's like, man, I can't get away from this. It's like, your thoughts are very difficult to control at times. You follow what your biology or your social thing wants to follow at times. And I think that's something that you need to remember. I don't think that just because you think something, you've done anything wrong, and I think that's the real issue I have with this commandment, because we're really introducing the idea that God has the right to control thoughts. And therefore, these are thoughts that you have to bring into captivity into Christ, as Paul would put it. I'm not trying to be rude about it. I'm just saying that, you can have thoughts without necessarily doing evil actions to others. And by sometimes engaging those thoughts, you begin to find out what you really want and what you really desire. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think a lot of things that are labeled as sinful thoughts are just humans being humans. We have a desire for sex that's, Christianity translates into lust. No, it's biological need. We have a desire to, have stuff so that we can have food and shelter and clothing and be safe. These are things that we try to acquire to ourselves. Nothing wrong with that. I think the real problem I have when I look at it from a deconversion standpoint, and when we look at this last commandment, is one of the things I really had to change as I've deconverted is a realization that not every thought that I think may be wholesome, but it doesn't mean, that I'm a lousy person. It just means that there are certain things that are going to pass through my brain. And so I don't really, get past that. And I don't really beat myself up as much over that anymore. It just isn't productive. And so, that's kind of, when we get back to this again, this whole commandment thing, this whole issue of authority, this whole issue of God having to control some of the uncontrollable aspects of humanity. And if we don't agree with that, we're sinners. And because we've sinned, we need, whatever snake oil cure the religious man is going to sell me that makes me right with God. And that's kind of the real danger of the commandments to me. The reason that the commandments suck is how they're used by religious leaders. They're used to control, they're used to manipulate, they're used to make people feel guilty, and then you come along and say, oh, I can have you guilt-free by introducing you to Jesus, and then you introduce this emotional concept, oh, you're free and you're cleansed, and all of a sudden this person becomes very grateful because you cleanse them, and they attend your church, and they drop the money in the basket, and that's exactly the merry-go-round that religion is. And once I got off of that merry-go-round, or see it for the merry-go-round it is, and the fraud that it is, that's what made me an anti-theist, a compassionate anti-theist, because these people are being led like sheep. And it's a sheep to a shearer and sometimes to slaughter. And it's something that needs to be stopped. If possible, it needs to be addressed. Because as I look at it more and more, some of the greatest catastrophes of all time, certain historical situations that last over centuries, have all been perpetrated by religion. And the basis for 3 of those religions is the Old Testament law, and at the centerpiece of that is the 10 Commandments. And the problem is, as I've demonstrated throughout this series, the 10 Commandments straight up suck. I'm going to conclude this series with my next video, part 10, and I'm going to basically do a video in that part about what some of the things the 10 Commandments could have said that would have made them better. And I'll deal with that when we get to that in a couple of days. In the meantime, I want to thank you for stopping by my channel again. Comments have a way of influencing the content in Friday's videos, so I respond to comments when I can. And when sometimes I think of a response for a comment, but I don't have the time to do it properly. And so, just be patient. I'll get to it. And sometimes I respond to comments with videos, and I don't necessarily say, oh, hey, this is what I want to say, because I think other people may have the same question or comment. You can also ask me a direct question anytime. I'm willing to answer anything within my expertise. And if it's not within my expertise, I'll tell you so. What would you like to see me do? Make some suggestions. Videos are uploaded Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I don't tolerate name calling in the comments necessarily. If you're going to demonstrate somebody as a fool, that's fine. Just don't call them one. Be sure to like, subscribe, and get your notifications set up as you see fit. And hopefully I can someday convince you to be a rabid atheist like myself. In the meantime, this is Rabyd, the Rabid Atheist, signing off. I wish you a good day, and goodbye.